At first, I would like to thank Jean-Louis Cohen and his assistants, Anna and Suzanne, for the invitation at NYU. I'm glad to be here because NYU is an institution that I have to confess, I first heard about when teenager I was watching Woody Allen movies. Today, a less funny thing, I will talk about the discourses on Japanese monumentality during World War II. It is a key issue because the architects who led the post-war international architecture have initially begun to shape their discourse during the war. Modernity, as the search for the most advanced technical, aesthetical, and social expression of an epoch, was led in Japan by a Western dream until the 30s and the war against China in 1937. Then, within 10 years, it has been redefined as a search for a new Japanese identity and its monumentality. This search for an historical legitimation of authority was characteristic of European and Japanese architecture before and during World War II. And in this sense, the case of Japan can be compared to that of Germany and Italy, despite the fact that the Emperor Hirohito was not as concerned about the political issues of architecture as Hitler and Mussolini. However, the Japanese government controlled architecture and urban planning. In 1941, under their influence, the architects created a committee for the construction of the so-called Greater East Asian Co-Prosperity Sphere. It is a long name that I will refer to in its original Japanese, Daitoa. This Greater Japanese Empire in East Asia, the Daitoa, had the objective to free Asia from European colonies by creating a new Asian zone of influence, free but controlled by Japan. The intellectualization of such discourses came with the Symposium on the Overcoming Modernity, held in Kyoto in 1942. There, the Japanese intellectuals met to rethink Japanese culture in the arts, literature, and philosophy. They reached a somewhat Hegelian or Marxist standpoint, suggesting that the overcoming of Western modernity would allow Japan to enter into a global history that would not be limited only to the West. There were no architects invited to that symposium, but in the field of architecture, similar issues had led to the development of a new Japanese architecture. Today, we will focus on the discourse of the so-called Japanese Le Corbusier School of Architecture. These are star architects, represented by Maekawa Kunio, Sakakura Junzo, Tange Kenzo, and their professor, Kishida Hideto. I will show you their proposals for the three main competitions of war monuments in Japan in 1939, 1942, and 1943, with a particular focus on the role of Tange Kenzo, who is representative of the generation of architects who started their career in the war context. This story starts in 1939 with the national competition for the construction of memorial towers for the fallen soldiers, Chureito in Japanese. The competitors would plan three types of monuments on the Asian battlefields and in Japan. The jury was mainly composed of representatives of the army and architects from Tokyo Imperial University, such as Ito Chuta, the first Orientalist Japanese architect. Ito became one of the main figures in the construction of a Japanese national architecture, both in Japan and in the Japanese colonies. For example, he built the Korean shrine, Chosen Jingu, in Seoul in 1925. The presence of Ito Chuta on the jury would have suggested that any modernist entries would be given a wide berth. Despite this, his assistant, Kishida Hideto, convinced the modern schools of architecture to enter the competition. The Chureito competition was very popular. It received more than 1,700 proposals. Pictures of the winning entries were published by the newspaper Asahi Shimbun in January 1940. They were very conventional in their forms, designed by young architects and war veterans. Tange did not personally enter the competition, but he helped Maekawa and Sakakura. Their submitted entries were surprising. Their schemes for a chureito in Manchuria referred to a recognizable oriental form, the pyramid, that had no correspondence in Japanese architecture. Maekawa cut the head of his pyramid and transformed it into a kind of narrow mastaba, more or less resembling Le Corbusier's scheme for the Mundaneum in Geneva. Sakakura designed a complex pyramid with a five-branch star plan integrated in a layout composition similar to that of the Tokugawa Shogun Mausoleum at Nikko. At another occasion, Sakakura imported the Mundaneum model as it is for a monument proposal in Tokyo in 1942. At that time, Maekawa and Sakakura were having cordial and professional contacts with the Army and the Navy. Sakakura was an active member of the Sumer Club, a nationalist group that met to discuss the renaissance of the Sumerian civilization. According to this ideology, the Sumerians had crossed Asia and settled in Japan, which has thus become the most creative and modern country in the region. These legends aim to demonstrate the universality of Japanese people and culture and the capacity of Japan to become a leading power on a world scale. In his explicative note for the Chureito competition, Sakakura wrote that by the construction of a memorial tower for the fallen soldiers, we wish to demonstrate the authority of the decisive power of creation of Japanese men in the world. Tange, the young Tange, may have learned from the defeats of his masters that their discourses were in line with the dominant thoughts, but their architecture were not Japanese enough. After the attack on Pearl Harbor in December 1941, the war became global and architects felt entrusted with the World Historical Mission. In April 1942, the Architectural Institute created a committee for the construction of the Daitoa. Kishida Hideto was in charge of the design policy. He appointed Tange as his secretary, Maekawa and Sakakura as committee members. Their first initiative was to launch a competition for the memorial of the Daitoa. This memorial could be placed anywhere in East Asia, and the design program was relatively free. They only required to design a work which expressed monumentality and traditionality using contemporary materials and techniques representing the new Japanese spirit. In July 1942, the members of the Architectural Institute organized a debate 2 days before the famous symposium, Overcoming Modernity. Compared to other cultural disciplines, the realm of architecture, a technical discipline inside the Faculty of Engineering, was not considered as a medium of political and cultural propaganda. And it seemed to have generated a certain amount of regret among architects. Kishida Hideto was then writing a history of German Nazi architecture. During the discussion, he considered that Japan had, quote, reached the level where architecture has to express the volition of the people and the spirit of the nation, and he quoted the German state architecture as an example. Another architect, Horiguchi Sutemi, well known for his researches on tea pavilion, usually a kind person, argued vigorously for a new Japanese architecture. He proposed that, quote, for instance, as the Japanese sword is still in use on the battlefield, in architecture there are also elements that we can still use, but we need a technical spirit that make good use of new materials, new structure, and new expressions in respect to the great spirit of the whole world under one roof, which is an imperialistic slogan. Putting Asia under a Japanese roof was an explicit goal of the Japanese Empire. In a way, Tange Kenzo had proposed something similar for the Daitoa Memorial. His winning scheme for a holy sanctuary on the slopes of Mount Fuji was designed to represent the matrix of all sanctuaries to be built in Asia. Referring to Shintoism, the state religion since Meiji, he designed a great shrine. This concrete building was physically and symbolically linked to the imperial house in Tokyo by a road and a railway, kind of autobahn. As routes of pilgrimage, they connected the divine Japanese empire, the divine Japanese man, to the divine Japanese nature, Mount Fuji. This sanctuary was planned according to the patterns of Shinto shrines. You can see here Ise Shrine, photographed by Watanabe Toshio, who worked with Tange Kenzo in 1962, and ancient imperial tombs. Tange's discourse was constructed under the usual mottos of Occidentalism. In his explicative notes, he wrote that Western monumentality is characterized by ascending forms that have, quote, lost contact with nature and territorial realities. End of quotes. These abstract forms, those of the pyramid, comes back, or the tower, are the, quote, symbol of the Occident's thirst for domination. In Tange's schemes for the Daitoa Memorial, the unification of man with nature, as one of the accomplishments of Shinto worship, is relayed by the construction of an architecture that melts into the environment. This fusion into nature is represented in his traditional rendering of the Daitoa Memorial. We may ask if such architecture is modern in any sense. If it is modern, it is obviously compromised by iconic representations of traditional architecture. It is not even postmodern because it does not provide a certain conscious distance on Japanese architecture. In contrast, it actually reveals a total empathy for this invented tradition. The respect for nature and environment as scientific arguments in the discourse of modern architects became almost religious avatars in the development of Japanese architecture. This traditional environment was an ideological and metaphysical statement for the expansion of Japanese culture in Asia. In 1943, the theme of the second competition of the Architectural Committee of the Daitoa was the construction of the Japanese Cultural Center in Bangkok. Kishida Hideto, once again the head of the jury, asked the competitors to base on a traditional architectural style expressing the identity of Japan and a, quote, modern classical imperial style. Paradoxically, he also recommended that entrants, quote, do not carry on solely imitation of the past. As expected, the 80 competitors' schemes formed a pageant of heteroclite Oriental architecture. However, the modern school won. Tange was first and Maekawa second. Tange's architectural discourse emphasized the Japanese conception of environmental order. He stated that, I quote, these ethical principles and the Japanese tradition of state planning represent the form of our character. They reveal our reverence to these values. It has nothing to do with the individualistic structure of Western architecture. There is only the Japanese way of planning an environmental order that can help us. By the end of the war, Japanese architects had reached a point of no return. By compromising themselves with Japan's political agenda, they had lost their free will, their raison d'être as modern creators. Today, historians have adopted a dispassionate approach to the analysis of these discourses, attempting to abstract architectural ideology from political issues. I do not aim to condemn the Japanese architect who worked during the war. Rather, I am simply to ask, Why is it the case that those who led the debate on the architecture of the Daitoa for the construction of a Japanese empire in Asia became the leading representatives of post-war Japanese architecture? To try to understand this phenomenon, it is worth pointing out that a whole generation of architects was involved in this debate. The fact that none of these war architectural monuments were ever built, their memory might have been easier to forget. Also, architecture was not considered, as I said, as a medium of political propaganda. And for these reasons, the architects, especially the youngest, have none been judged. Soon after the war, Tange participated in the reconstruction of Hiroshima. In 1949, Kishida Hideto headed the competition jury for the construction of a peace memorial in Hiroshima, and the winner was Tange Kenzo. You're not following. This building is the most visited modern monument in Japan. It is a symbol of the reconstruction of Japan and an example of Japanese modern architecture. His principles of monumentality are similar to those of the schemes designed by Tange some years before. Here you see the first model of this peace memorial. Here you see the Daitoa Memorial, and you can see that the form of the place, which is actually imported from the Michelangelo Campidoglio in a way, and Le Corbusier Soviet Palace, is the same. Here you see the facade of the Japanese Cultural Center in Bangkok, and you can see also that the general proportion of the facade is very similar to that of Hiroshima Peace Center. About his reference to Japanese architecture, Tange stated that he felt more freedom after the war in understanding it in a modern sense, as a mental image, abstracted from its iconic representations. This type of discourses on tradition became the mainstream for Japanese contemporary architects. International architects such as Kurokawa, Maki, Isozaki, Ando, even Kuma have presented their personal views on Japanese architecture as if they had to define their degree of Japaneseness before entering the international scene. This Japaneseness that Western eyes want to see in the works of Japanese architects can be regarded as their specific originality, but it is also an Occidental view of an exotic modernity. Paradoxically, by compromising the fate of modernity with their national traditions, Japanese architects have adapted their discourses in line with contingent agendas and seem to have succeeded in overcoming the universal character of modernity. Still, looking back in history, we can see that the virtue of Japanese architecture, respectful to the values of environment and regional tradition, as well as those of rational and technical modernity, the virtues praised by Western architects, such as Walter Gropius, that you can see here in a charming position in 1954, invited by Tange Kenzo in Japan. These virtues correspond also to the discursive strategies produced by Japanese architects during the war. This troubled origin of contemporary architecture stemmed from discourses on national monumentality, showing us that the construction of modernity is actually a compromise with the past. I thank you.